Since we already unravelled the chaotic mess that is the black bear family tree, it's only fair we give the brown bears their turn. Because around here, we believe in equal opportunity for bear confusion. Let's dig into the first half of this lineup and see just how messy this family tree gets. Oh, and if some random brown bear footage sneaks in where it doesn't belong, well, sorting out a dozen nearly identical bears is harder than it looks. The grizzly bear, Ursus arctos horribilis, which is honestly a fantastic name, all things considered. This is the heavyweight brawler of the North American wilderness, a subspecies of brown bear that's made itself at home everywhere from the dense forests of Alaska to the rugged pockets of the lower 48. Despite the fearsome name, grizzly isn't actually a personality review. It's a reference to their grizzled fur, where lighter tips frost over darker underfur, like nature couldn't settle on a single colour scheme. Of course, the attitude sometimes lives up to the name, especially if you catch one off guard. Adult males can weigh anywhere from 400 to 800 pounds, and on the salmon-packed coasts of Alaska, some tip the scales well over 1,000 pounds. On all fours, they stand around 3.5 to 4 feet at the shoulder, and if one decides to stand up for a better look, they'll tower over most grown men at more than 7 feet tall. Despite all that bulk, they can sprint at 35 miles per hour, which is the kind of fact that makes you rethink those old just-run-downhill bear safety tips. The easiest way to pick a grizzly out of a lineup, other than the permanent bad mood, is the shoulder hump, a built-in slab of muscle powering their front legs like a biological backhoe. It's a handy feature when your lifestyle involves smashing apart logs, digging up roots, or excavating rodent burrows just to see who's home. They thrive in forests, mountain meadows, river valleys, and even wide-open plains, tweaking their diet to whatever's on hand. Along the coast, salmon is the seasonal jackpot, but inland bears rely more on roots, berries, insects, and scavenged carcasses. They're omnivores in the purest sense, as comfortable gorging on berries as they are tearing into a moose carcass. Their sense of smell is so sharp they can detect food from miles away, even if it's buried underground or tucked inside something humans thought was bear-proof. Grizzly reproduction comes with its own evolutionary quirks. Mating happens in spring, but the female's body hits the pause button on the pregnancy. The fertilized egg floats around for a few months, and the female has until late summer to pack on enough weight to convince her body that raising cubs is worth the effort. If she's fat enough, the egg implants and development continues. If not, no cubs this year. But when they do, it's usually between 1 and 3 cubs, born in midwinter within the safety of the den. They spend the next 2 to 3 years closely bonded to their mother, learning the essential skills of bear survival. Compared to black bears, grizzlies are much less inclined to back down from a fight. Part of that comes from their size, but it's also because grizzly cubs have a lot more to worry about. Wolves, mountain lions, and even other bears. Grizzly mothers don't take chances, so they default to aggressive overkill at the first sign of trouble. Grizzlies also loom large in indigenous cultures, often seen as symbols of strength, wisdom, and power, or as guardians of the land itself. Modern culture has leaned hard into the grizzly's image, from the revenant to sports mascots, usually painting them as either unstoppable killing machines or misunderstood loners. Reality, as always, lands somewhere in between. They're highly intelligent, often cautious, and intensely curious omnivores with very little tolerance for being startled. If grizzlies are the heavyweight fighters of the mainland, Kodiak bears are the undisputed champions of the islands. The Kodiak bear, Ursus arctos middendorfi, holds the title of largest brown bear in the world, and the only reason it isn't in the running for biggest bear overall is because the polar bear exists. Found exclusively on the Kodiak archipelago in southern Alaska, this bear has spent the last 12,000 or so years evolving in isolation, and it shows. With no serious competition and a salmon buffet delivered fresh every year, Kodiak bears grew big. Really big. Adult males can weigh over 1,500 pounds in peak summer condition, and some exceptionally well-fed individuals have tipped the scales at over 1,700 pounds. Standing on all fours, they're already around 5 feet tall at the shoulder. and when they rear up, they can clear 10 feet, a height that makes even grizzlies look underdressed. Size aside, Kodiak bears aren't drastically different from their mainland relatives. They share the same general shape, with the signature shoulder hump, broad concave face, and powerful digging claws. But everything about the Kodiak bear feels scaled up: thicker limbs, massive paws, and a skull broad enough to double as a coffee table. It gives them a serious advantage when it comes to competing for food, which on an island can get surprisingly tense. Even with abundant salmon, there are only so many prime fishing spots, and the biggest bears tend to get the best seats at the river. Kodiak bears are a bit more tolerant of each other than grizzlies, mostly because they have to be. The best fishing spots draw crowds, and while there's still plenty of posturing and bluff charging, actual fights are surprisingly rare. Mothers with cubs, though, still get priority, and most other bears know better than to argue. Like other brown bears, Kodiaks hibernate through the winter, though the length and timing depends heavily on food availability and weather. Well-fed bears in mild winters may den for only a few months, while others settle in for the long haul if food gets scarce. While Kodiak bears are isolated, they're not genetically distinct enough to qualify as a separate species. They're still Ursus arctos, just supersized. Their DNA reveals that they've been isolated from mainland brown bears since the end of the last ice age. But there's been enough occasional gene flow to keep them firmly in the brown bear family. Indigenous Alutiiq communities have lived alongside these giants for thousands of years, respecting the bear as both a powerful spirit and a dangerous neighbour. The Eurasian brown bear might not have the celebrity status of its grizzly and Kodiak cousins, but it's no lightweight either. This is the most widespread brown bear subspecies in the world, roaming across forests, mountains and remote wilderness from Western Europe, all the way across Russia and into parts of northern China. If you're picturing a big shaggy bear wandering through the Alps or the dense forests of Scandinavia, that's your Eurasian brown bear. They sit comfortably in the middle of the brown bear spectrum, larger than most black bears but nowhere near the beefy dimensions of Kodiaks. Adult males typically weigh between 400 and 600 pounds, though particularly well-fed individuals in more remote areas can push 800 pounds. Their coats range from dark brown to a paler golden shade, often with a slightly paler collar or muzzle, but there's no standard dress code. Colour varies wildly depending on location, genetics, and how much rolling around they've done in forest dirt. These bears are the ultimate generalists, equally at home in dense forests, alpine meadows, rocky hillsides, and even tundra. This flexibility is why they've held on across so much of their historic range, long after many of their larger relatives retreated into smaller territories. They'll eat whatever the neighbourhood offers: berries, nuts, roots, insects, fish, small mammals and carrion all make the cut. And they're not above helping themselves to crops or livestock if humans build their farms too close to bare real estate. Like other brown bears, Eurasian brown bears hibernate through the winter, digging out dens in hillsides, hollow trees or caves, depending on what's available. They are mostly solitary, but they're not above sharing space when food is particularly abundant, especially around salmon streams or prime berry patches. Most of the time, though, they prefer to avoid unnecessary confrontations, opting for bluff charges and dramatic posturing rather than actual fights. The Siberian brown bear, also known as Ursus arctos calaris, is what happens when you take your standard Eurasian brown bear and crank up the wilderness factor. Found across the vast forests, rugged mountains and remote river valleys of eastern Russia, particularly in Siberia, this bear is one of the largest and most powerful brown bear subspecies, built to handle a climate that's half frozen wasteland, half mosquito apocalypse. When you live somewhere that can swing from -50 degrees Celsius in winter to clouds of bloodthirsty insects in summer, you either adapt or you move. Siberian brown bears are impressive even by brown bear standards. Adult males can weigh anywhere from 600 to over 1,200 pounds, putting them solidly between your average mainland grizzly and a well-fed Kodiak. Their fur tends to be long, thick, and a little scruffier than their western cousins, thanks to the joys of Siberian winters. Their coloration ranges from dark brown to lighter shades, with some individuals sporting a pale collar-like band around the neck, which is where the collaris part of their name comes from. And while the American grizzly gets all the credit for toughness, Siberian bears deal with a whole other level of harsh conditions. In winter, they hibernate for up to 7 months, tucked into dens dug into hillsides or tree roots, waiting out temperatures cold enough to freeze the moisture inside their nostrils. Diet-wise, Siberian brown bears follow the standard brown bear playbook, eating whatever's available and calorie-dense enough to justify the effort. In spring and summer, it's plants, berries, roots, insects and small animals. When the salmon runs start in rivers flowing into the Sea of Okhotsk, they gorge like it's an all-you-can-eat buffet, packing on fat for the winter ahead. They'll also happily scavenge any carcasses they stumble across, including those left behind by wolves or hunters. In some areas, they've been known to actively hunt elk, moose, and wild boar, especially in regions where meat is easier to come by than berries. Outside of mating season or prime salmon spots, they prefer to keep to themselves, though when two big males do cross paths, posturing, bluff charging and loud opinions about personal space are almost guaranteed. The Himalayan brown bear, also known as Ursus arctos isabellinus, isn't just a bear. It's proof that evolution occasionally gets bored and decides to challenge an animal just to see what happens. Living high in the Himalayas and parts of northern Pakistan, India, Nepal and Tibet, these bears navigate steep cliffs, rocky valleys and thin air, all while being one of the most endangered brown bear subspecies in the world. Physically, Himalayan brown bears are slightly shorter-legged and stockier than their lower-altitude relatives, with shaggy pale brown to reddish-brown fur that acts like a built-in survival parka. That lighter coloration, sometimes described as isabelline, is actually where their subspecies name comes from. They're smaller than grizzlies or Siberian bears, with adult males usually maxing out around 300 to 550 pounds, though given the harsh conditions, finding a heavyweight is rare. Still, what they lack in bulk, they make up for in grit. Life at high altitude means being opportunistic, and Himalayan brown bears are masters of improvisation. Their diet is a seasonal buffet ranging from grasses, roots and berries to insects, small mammals, and the occasional unfortunate livestock. Scavenging is a critical survival tool, and these bears are quick to clean up after avalanches, predators, or any unfortunate yak that missed its footing. They're also known to raid farms in some areas, especially where human settlements edge too close to bear territory, a habit that hasn't exactly helped their reputation with local herders. Hibernation, when it happens, is a long-term strategy in the higher elevations. They den up in caves or rock crevices, often digging out impressively cozy dens on steep slopes where predators, or overly curious humans, are unlikely to stumble across them. Himalayan brown bears are textbook loners, rarely seen in pairs outside of brief mating encounters or mothers raising cubs. In places where food is scarce, they'll defend feeding areas aggressively, even against snow leopards or wolves, both of which would probably prefer not to argue with a bear if given the option. And in true brown bear fashion, they'd rather bluff and posture than actually fight. Though if it comes down to it, they've got the power to back it up. If the Himalayan brown bear is tough, the Gobi bear, Ursus arctos gobiensis, is next-level stubborn, because it's trying to be a bear in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The Gobi Desert isn't exactly prime bear habitat. It's a barren, windswept, scorching landscape where food is scarce, water is scarcer, and the temperature swings could give anyone whiplash. And yet, somehow, a handful of brown bears have decided to stick it out. Gobi bears are technically a subspecies of the brown bear, though they're smaller, scruffier, and living so far outside the usual bear comfort zone that they barely seem related to their salmon-chomping cousins up north. Adult males rarely exceed 250 pounds, making them some of the smallest brown bears alive. They tend to have light brown or sandy-coloured fur. When it comes to food, Gobi bears operate on extreme flexibility, which is a polite way of saying they eat whatever they can find. Roots, desert plants, the occasional rodent, and whatever insects are foolish enough to show their faces all make the cut. There's no salmon run, no lush berry patches, and no convenient alpine meadows full of goodies. Instead, these bears wander vast distances across the desert, following seasonal water sources and occasionally hitting the jackpot when they stumble across carrion. In some cases, wild rhubarb and other hardy desert plants make up over half of their diet. It's not gourmet living, but it works. Gobi bears also hibernate, though it's not your standard snowy den situation. Instead of curling up under a blanket of snow like their northern relatives, they tuck themselves into caves, rocky crevices, or any other shelter they can find, a strategy that's about staying cool as much as staying warm. Their hibernation periods can be shorter and more irregular, heavily influenced by food availability and the sheer unpredictability of desert weather. Socially, there's not much to say, because there aren't enough of them to form much of a social scene. Estimates suggest there may be fewer than 40 Gobi bears left, making them one of the rarest bears on the planet. With so few individuals scattered across such a huge area, most Gobi bears live profoundly solitary lives, only crossing paths during brief mating encounters or when two bears happen to hit the same rare waterhole at the same time. Even then, they'd usually rather avoid a fight. In a place where calories are a currency, no one's wasting energy on unnecessary drama. That's it for the first half of our brown bear lineup. But we're not done yet. In part 2, we've got island bears, forest bears, and a few that manage to stay so far off the radar, they might as well be bear-shaped rumors. So if you thought brown bears only came in one standard issue model, think again. Part 2 might be coming soon.